solar mini-grids have turned from small pilots to an electrification wave. We were there when mini-grid regulation was established. When financial transactions were closed, we saw new technology thrive and companies fail. This is where we tell the stories. This is where we discuss the future. The mini-grid business, powered by Inensys.
Hello, this is Nico. Today we are talking about mini-grid logistics, daring the impossible. My guests are Chris Rollins and Davide Ceretti, both of whom are engineers with vast experience in constructing mini-grids in rural Africa and beyond. Chris Rollins is a registered professional engineer in Colorado and Alaska, USA, with 2 decades of experience designing and building technical infrastructure in rural sub-Saharan Africa. He's currently managing the survey, GIS, engineering, procurement, logistics, and construction of 22 solar mini-grids in Turkana County in northern Kenya for Kudura Power East Africa. Davide Ceretti is an energy enthusiast working around the globe since 2005. He's passionate about energy and sustainability, and nowadays has a particular interest in energy transition strategies, green energy projects, and management. Davide was Jumeme's country director during the mini-grid rollout phase and recently joined in Green as COO. Davide, Chris, welcome. Chris, what components do mini-grids consist of, and which of those are the most difficult to transport?
All right, so for my grids, not counting power plant, I have about 27 different parts. And I look at it according to the work breakdown structure, which would divide the site into the fencing, the power plant, the LV reticulation, and the home wiring. In my experience, the heavy things are the hardest to transport, and that's obviously poles. We are using 10-meter CCA traded eucalyptus utility poles. They probably weigh about 300 each, 300 kilos. They can weigh more. A lot of times they've recently been harvested and they aren't fully cured. It's a big problem for O&M as well. But getting them to site in a big lorry, we transport as many as 120 at a time. We get stuck in the sand. We get stuck in the mud. Very difficult to maneuver the lorry where you want it, and offloading with local villagers is problematic. It's very unsafe and not easy to do. We really need heavy equipment for that, but we don't have it.
Yeah, and you don't bring that heavy equipment on site, right?
We can't. It's not available here.
I see.
You know, I can't get a crane truck, or even if I had a winch or something, I probably don't have a tree in the right location to attach to that.
Yeah.
What they often do, though, if there is a tree, they'll just move the lorry backward and forward to remove the poles. But, you know, that's maybe a quarter or a third of my sites.
Yeah. Davide, what is so special about logistics in rural Africa compared to other parts of the world?
Well, I guess Chris already introduced the topic. I mean, you have many difficulties that come basically from the fact that you are in very rural areas with very poor infrastructures. And it's, in a word, you can say that is quite unpredictable. You have to consider many things, and that many things change during the year and year after years. So yeah, if you put everything together, now, considering the poor infrastructures, considering the environment situation, that is what is making really challenging the logistic in Africa. And as I said, unpredictable.
I could add to that one of my biggest problems really is that there's no set rate for anything, and there's no consistency in the types of trucks available. You know, whether it's a 5-ton or a 10-ton or a 20-ton, a single rear axle or a dual rear axle. It's a random roll of the dice how much you're going to pay for something until you develop relationships. And that can take 3, 4, 5 months. And by that time, your project is over. So this has been my biggest problem is, you know, how much is it worth to transport this 3 tons of equipment from point A to B? Is this a good price? Is it not a good price? Is this person able to do it? You know, there's no like base point to start from.
Yeah. And Chris, do I get you correctly that truck companies are not making long-term plans? Are they just picking up whatever they can get today and ship it to wherever they need to ship it tomorrow, and then they make new plans, so there's no scheduling?
Yes. In the center of the town here in Lodwar, for example, all the trucks park and they just sit there until somebody comes up and they negotiate a deal. And that's how we started. Now, of course, if you're in the capital city, trucks are going to have long-term agreements with various companies moving from warehouse to warehouse or from warehouse to distribution center or whatever. But we're out in the bush. And so I'm just trying to find a guy with a truck and see if he's available to move this stuff, if he's able to load it. That's a huge problem. Once something's offloaded, it can be very difficult to get it back on a truck again. And yeah, it's just ad hoc. There's no standard at all for anything.
There is something Chris mentioned that is quite important. Normally, when you are doing a mini grid project, you are trying to go as fast as possible to decrease, the cost. And that is somehow problematic because, as Chris said, most of the relations are informal, which means that you really need to have a specific knowledge of the specific area to exactly understand the prices, the ways, and how to interact with the available transporter. If you are not from that area and you are moving around like me and Chris were doing, you don't have time to create that experience. So you basically rely on the experience that you did in the past and you're trying to adapt yourself.
But trucks are not the only mode of transport, right? There are other modes of transport. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Let me take this. We, together with you, Nico, we had quite of a challenge to transport materials on the highland. There, of course, the trucks are not an option, or else might be part of the transport, but both are quite often used, especially to transport materials that are not too heavy. However, it's even more problematic if you have to transport on a lake or on a river, because if something happened, you might lose completely the equipment, which means that you need to pay extra attention, and you have, unfortunately, to rely more often, even more on formal transporter, with logistical challenge that changes. If you have to transport on the road, mud, sand, so rains, the seasons is something you have to consider, while instead if you are transporting on the rivers or on the lakes, you need to consider where the boat then have to unload. And sometimes it's not available any place where to unload. So it's becoming even more interesting, if you want.
Yeah. Chris, do you want to add?
Yeah, I can add to that. And this is an opportunity to segue into people versus stuff. So Davide has the experience of boats. I have the experience of Cessna caravans in South Sudan to get over conflict areas. But generally speaking, you've got trucks and you've got non-trucks, okay? And the trucks are for heavy stuff. That would be like cables or your conductors, the poles, the stay anchors. They're buried in the ground. They weigh about 25 kilos each, and you might need 100 of them. Those can be 5-ton trucks, 10-ton, 20-ton, and lorries, which here carry up to about 26 tons. And you often, for me at least, because we have so much sand and mud, you want a dual axle rear truck. So that's the 20 tons. That's for carrying your stuff. And you want to do that one way. In other words, you want to take that from the factory and drop it right at your site if you can. You don't want to offload it because then you can't reload it again. Then conversely, you have the small stuff and the people. And that can be more easily moved around by motorbike. Here we have pro boxes and mini buses, pro box being the ubiquitous station wagon from Japan. And then you have the Hilux or the Land Cruiser. A lot of people like the Hilux because it looks cool, like this is a construction company, we need a Hilux. But I don't find them that useful because they can only carry about a ton. And now I need to make multiple trips for the stay anchors or the pole dressing or whatever else. So, if I had my druthers, I would have, for my project, I'd have one pro box and one 5-ton truck. And you might have seen from my posts on LinkedIn, I've got 7 dudes on motorbikes. And I have one myself. And really, that is the way to do stuff out here. Yeah. I can get a TVS 150 for a little more than $1,000. It's incredibly cheap to operate and maintain. I can put 2 people on it. I can put a person plus 100 kilos of whatever. I can carry tools. Motorbikes are the key that unlocks the mini grid construction for me. Yeah. Can't emphasize that enough.
Yeah, Chris, earlier you mentioned offloading on site and that it's quite risky to do so. And you usually in a mini grid site, you do that with labor, right? People, 20 people, 30 people.
Yes.
Trying to offload the poles, trying to offload especially the cables, right? How do you offload cables? Like tons of aluminium on a big drum.
Offloading is easy. You stack up 4 to 8 tires below the lorry. Everybody stands back, and then 2 guys push it off, and it lands with a thud and rolls maybe a meter, at least where we are in the sand. You've got to pick your spot. Reloading is problematic.
Impossible.
Well, actually, one of my guys, Alex Muiti, has unlocked it. And, thankfully, we were able to get cables in shorter lengths from the manufacturer. So all of our cable drums are below 500 kilos. And, Alex and my guys managed to load up some all-aluminum conductor the other day into the back of a Hilux from our office, and just using a piece of wood, which I thought was a terrible idea, but they did it without telling me. But I've now actually purchased a couple of C channels, so we're going to start doing it that way. So again, if you strategically place the truck, roll the cable into position, and then 4 people or 6 people or whatever, you can get it up onto a Hilux. But of course, you would rather have dropped it in the right location the first time, which I often neglect to do.
Yeah, but 600 or 500 kilograms for 6 people? That is already a lot for one person to carry, right? And if you imbalance a little bit, then one person can simply break down. Don't you think so?
Well, I wasn't there when they did it. I think we're going to do a more methodical thing now, like I said, with the C channels and using a round tube to push it up into position. Some of these folks are used to heavy objects. My team from Western Kenya is... undaunted with a 300 kilo utility pole. But the Turkana folks, the local population, they're pastoralists, they're herders. They watch goats and camels all day. They don't carry stuff. They don't dig. They don't, have physical jobs. So for them, it's overwhelming. That's a big problem for us.
I think that whatever can roll, it might be easier to be moved, no?
Yes.
So like cables, because for example, for the medium voltage lines, normally you have a much higher weight. But what the experience teaches you is that you have really to look at the past. So you are starting again to consider lever, how to park a car or truck in a way that can be easier to push something on. I mean, you are starting really to think about small things and a very ancient solution. But yes, you mentioned something very important, that is the safety. I mean, most of the time, these guys that you're working with, people from the villages and so on, are really underestimating the danger that they are passing through.
How do you guide those people then? They usually walk through the danger zones and you cannot protect them from any falling items or so. Do you install fences before you offload? Probably not.
No, exactly. Normally you are trying to concentrate the most dangerous activities on an area, or else, if not possible, you are trying to be there when you know that something potentially very dangerous is happening.
Yeah, this is very
when
true.
things are down from the track, most of the problems already passed. Now I'm thinking about how they are erecting the poles, Chris. I guess you can tell us many stories about these.
Well, yeah, for pole erection, at least I have my linesman team on site, and they have experience with tens of thousands of poles between them. And we have the right equipment. We're using PPE, steel-toed boots and helmets and gloves. But offloading, yeah, that's a different story. And for me, I've got 20 sites. I can't be at more than maybe 2 to 5% of my offloading events. And often my site overseers or my other staff can't be there either. And to compound that, you've got a truck driver who wants to get back to Nairobi or wherever he came from. So he wants to offload at 1 o'clock in the morning. And so we have very little control over that. Obviously, we have international investors that hold us to a very stringent health and safety criteria. And, I'll be honest, I often require the offloading to be done by the vendor so that it is not my fault if something happens. It's still my problem, but I'm not liable for it. And, recently we did have a young man break his femur offloading in the middle of the night in a controlled area that was fenced. We often offload poles in one spot and reload them onto a smaller truck to get them up the side of Lake Turkana, which is extremely sandy. But yeah, the vendor was responsible for that. They refused to pay the hospital bill, or let's say they went silent. same thing effectively. And, I'm working that community where that guy is from. So I can't just let that languish. The guy's sitting in the hospital with an unpaid bill, and he was taken care of at least. But yeah, health and safety in these is off topic, but it's critical. And the honest truth is you have very, very little control over this.
Yeah, you said, Chris, that the investors have the strictest health and safety rules usually. But what about the country's labor laws and these kind of things that also have some health and safety related aspects in there?
Yeah, here in Kenya, we have the Occupational and Safety and Health Act.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
And it's very vague compared to something like the United States OSHA regulations. Our biggest concern would be fall from heights, which they do define. I think it's, 2 meters or something you can't stand above. Other things, they're very vague. It's an undeveloped regulation. I'm not the health and safety person for this project, but the honest truth there is you try to make sure everybody's got a safety vest, a helmet, and steel-toed boots in the photos. But the reality is, you've got all these sites with all these villagers. We're paying them to excavate holes. Of course, they want as much money to stay in the community as possible, and I agree with that. But that really just comes down to digging and carrying stuff. And you can provide PPE, and then that laborer refuses to give it back at the end of the day, and then he or she doesn't show up the next day. And so now you've lost a pair of boots and a helmet and a vest. It's not a manageable thing. And the investors are not in tune with that reality. They think that they can promote or enforce European level of health and safety, and you just can't. Even with $1 million budgeted, you can't. So that's the reality for us.
Yeah, for our audience, PPE means?
Personal protective equipment. Yeah, it's a common term. For a mini-grid site, that would mean helmet, steel-toed boots, gloves, overalls. They get quite scruffed up moving these poles around. And then, of course, there's a whole nother list of equipment for electrical installations, but that's not really part of this topic today.
Yeah, coming back to a different subject, Davide, that you mentioned earlier, sometimes lorries or trucks got stuck in sand or mud. I guess there are many interesting stories. A lot of headache, probably.
Yeah, many. No, as I was saying, you're trying to organize, to plan in a way that you are as far as possible from the seasonality that will not allow you to move things. But the reality is then transport, maybe from China or from wherever materials come from, get stuck in somewhere in a harbor or in the customs, and then you have to deal with rain seasons, for example, and there things becomes really unpredictable. I worked in the highlands in Tanzania where the rain season was quite heavy, and trucks simply stuck on the mountains, and there's no way to get a kind of excavator or whatever else to push them. And so you're using 100 people, really with a rope and, trying to put something under the wheels in a way that they are getting some grip to move on. It's something, fascinating if you want. The manpower becomes again the main actor of the logistics. Seems to go back some centuries ago.
Yeah, and interestingly, if a truck gets stuck somewhere, it's not only the truck that gets stuck, but all the cars behind the truck also get stuck because the roads are so narrow that you cannot pass. And it's really an issue because in some cases, there's just this one road that goes to a certain village or to a certain area, and there's no other because there is forest all around, or there's simply lake or more mud or more sand. And have you ever experienced a truck getting stuck and you cannot move the truck until the rainy season or so is over?
No, that not. We always found a way out, but in some cases it took us 2-3 days. Because the rain season is not constant, so you are waiting up to when it's stopping to rain, and you are, then go really, really fast, to put the truck back on the road, move a bit ahead, at least, to reach a place in where you can maybe even unload a bit. Because what we were saying before is that if you take something out from the truck, then it's very difficult to put it on again, but sometimes you don't have any chance to do differently.
Yeah, there's no option, right?
Exactly, there's no option.
And you were talking about bringing equipment to islands in Lake Victoria. That automatically means that you have to handle each individual piece of equipment twice or three times or so. Put it on the truck, get it from the truck onto the ship or onto the boat. Sometimes, in rare cases, I guess you can put the whole truck onto a ferry. But in many cases, there are no ferries going to these islands. And what do you do then?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, many times you have to unpack and divide into small pieces. And this is actually something that the designer of the mini grid should consider. Personally, the thing that I consider more difficult to be transported in that context are batteries. We are looking at mini grids that are built with quite big lithium bass, and that are particularly heavy. So now, if you don't have a way to kind of divide it in smaller packages, it can become really a problem.
Yeah.
Because you cannot carry on a small boat, and which means that then you have to consider to have a more formal transport. And if there is no ferry, you might even hire a ferry. You rent to transport around the island, but then you need to build up even where the ferry have to stop on the island. And that is something that you have to consider.
So you kind of build a small harbor just for little equipment for a mini grid.
Exactly. Exactly. You have to build the harbor for the island.
Interesting.
Which is fine
Interesting.
for them.
Interesting.
But we did in the past. For a couple of things, we had to build a kind of very small harbor where the ferry could unload the heavier part of the equipment.
Some kind of wooden quay or something?
Exactly.
I see.
Exactly. Made by wood.
Yeah, interesting. And is that one still standing, or has it been dismantled after the shipment?
Well, nowadays, some year passed, so I don't know. I guess if has not been maintained, it's not any longer there. But if it was used, it might be still there. I don't know, honestly. I never came back to check it. But I can ask.
Yeah, we touched already upon the interlinkages between logistics, transport, installation, but also procurement and planning of and designing of systems. Chris, do you want to guide us through these linkages a little bit and what they are and how these linkages play out afterwards in a later stage of project delivery and implementation?
Yeah, sure. So obviously there is a perfect sequence where you would have accurate survey data, you would do a design for that particular village, generate a bill of quantities, a list of all the materials. And then you would start a procurement process whereby, you're pre-ordering poles and the dressing that attaches the cables and conductors to the poles, then the cables and conductors, the ancillary stuff like the stays, and then little things, meters, ready boards, home wiring, ground rods. My own experience is that these don't happen in the perfect sequence. You might get to a site and realize that your survey data is wrong and you need to redesign, or you might have people working and ready for the poles, but the poles are not actually available because they've been sold to the local utility company at a higher price in a much higher quantity. Of course, there's the logistics nightmare of the truck stuck in the mud or the sand, though that's usually just a day or two. But yeah, the procurement best practice is to write a request for quotations, to float it for 2 or 3 weeks so that different vendors can review the material and give you an accurate price. Your tender would include the specifications and the quantities and delivery conditions and everything else. Though that is straightforward, you'll find people are not submitting all the required documents because they're used to just giving a price and being done with that. But, your investors or your grant funders require a much more elaborate submission. Then getting the stuff fabricated, right now I've heard there's no aluminum available in Kenya. So cables and conductors are off the table for a few weeks. Luckily, we've already purchased most of what we need. But then there's payment. Some people will take 50% up front and 50% on delivery. Others insist on 100% up front, and maybe your company refuses to do 100% up front. And now you get into this week-long back and forth about whether you can collect the materials for dispatch to your sites. I'm going through that right now. So all the while, you're trying to keep people busy And of course, the sequence on a mini grid site is pegging the pole locations, excavating the poles and the stay locations, then placing the poles and the stays. We're doing it with dressing on it. A lot of people wait on that because the dressing might get stolen, even if it's 8 meters up. And then you place the cables on it. But right now, and many times previously, I would have a bunch of holes excavated and no poles available. So I say, okay, go peg and excavate another site. And then the holes start collapsing because of sand or child vandals or homeowners that don't want a hole in their front yard. Camel's going to step in that and break its leg. And so, yeah, for me, with the numerous sites, I've had to move people back and forth constantly as the availability of materials changes. For example, we were going to start home wiring service lines and meter installations at a site called Makutano today, but we don't have any aerial bundled cable for the service lines because we didn't make the payment on Friday afternoon. And those guys are just sitting today, which they need a break. They've been working straight for weeks, but they get paid a unit rate for installation. So they just want to work as hard as they can until Christmas and walk away with a bundle of cash, So maybe if you had one big project and you had a year to do it and you already had some good familiarity with the conditions in that country or that region, that area, then you could have a more favorable sequence of the works. But that has not been the case for me at all. And I've had that problem other places too, previous jobs, with Power Hive, although they had a lot of stuff in storage at a warehouse. Unlike, we're doing more of a just-in-time delivery type of approach here because we don't have a warehouse and we don't have the people or facilities to offload and reload like I described. Even when you have a warehouse full of stuff, you might not be organized enough to get all the material out to site on the day it's needed. And then the EPC contractor is enforcing penalties on you for that. And of course, they're not incentivized to remind you because they get $150 a day to just sit there and wait for you to remember that you forgot to deliver the cable. So, yeah, many levels of problem with that.
As a mini-grid company, you have various options. You can either do everything yourself, like do multi-sourcing, purchase the PV panels here, purchase the poles there, purchase the cables there, purchase the battery from a different vendor, and then bring everything into country or purchase it from within the country, bring it to site and install yourself. Or you could actually contract an EPC company that does everything for you, including the logistics until everything's set up. And then you just, basically get the key.
Turnkey.
The turnkey, exactly. And off you go. How much money do you think? Because also the EPC companies, they need to somehow calculate risk. And there is a lot of risk, as we've already discussed, in logistics in Africa, in construction in rural Africa. How much is the difference? If everything goes well, everything goes smoothly, how much money could you save by doing it yourself?
By doing yourself, you can save normally 40 to 50% of the cost, sometimes even more, depending on the dimension of the project, of course. The smaller is the project, the higher is the money that you can save, the percentage, because EPC contractor will charge a lot for the risks, and moreover, they will have to go as fast as possible, which means that they are trying to source whatever they need, and you will pay for that. You might be in an area where you don't have excavator. Allow me this example. But if I am an EPC contractor that I have to go fast, I will take the excavator from wherever, and then I will charge the cost for you. That will allow me to go faster, but it will cost you a lot. So yeah, in my experience, you can really decrease the price of 50%.
Yeah, which means that bringing an excavator in contrast to using local labor with shovels and spades, of course, the excavator accelerates things, but it also doesn't create local employment, at least for a certain time. If you do it yourself, if you're willing to work with the community, you can save cost, but you can also create some local employment, create some kind of bonding with the community, get to know the community better, and so on. As a mini-grid company, I think that has some value. Don't you think so?
Exactly. And not only employment. For me, a mini-grid project need to be not only accepted by the community, but you need to create a kind of a sense of ownership on their side, which means that they are working into, they are really understanding how this project is difficult. And most of everything, they really understand how to do it. Of course, not the really technical part, but you need to have some kind of capacity building and working inside the project is the first step to create this capacity.
I could add some comments about costing. So I came up with a price estimate for these 20 mini grids. It started as 20, now we're at 22, which was around $600,000. And that was based on some work I did for PowerHive a couple of years ago during COVID lockdown. And I think it was accurate. But when we first started getting submissions for fencing, the first part of the project, you want a secure place that you can store things and eventually place the power plant. We found costs coming in 2 to 3 times what I estimated. And there's a number of factors there. Unique geography up here, very far from the capital, 600 kilometers plus add a 300 to my most distant sites from Lodwar. History of NGOs and the largesse associated with that. People think, oh, this is an NGO needing a fence. I can charge them 20,000 euros for a 40 meter by 40 meter fence. Whereas the materials are about 2,000, 2.5, and the labor would be another 500. So we decided not to go the EPC route, assuming that would come in well over €1 million. And now it looks like I'm going to do it for about 400. So let's say I'm saving about 33%, not the 50 that Davide mentioned, but every circumstance is different. And the way I'm doing that is by tendering and buying the lowest cost thing according to our donors and investors. Not the best choice, but it is what it is. I have a very small team, lean and mean. I've worked with them before. I trust them. They know what to do. The quality is very high. We don't have to go back and redo things, not often. So we're saving quite a bit based on my EPC estimate, but my EPC estimate was probably off by roughly half or a third of what it would actually cost up in this part of Africa. So Davide is right, but also every situation is different according to geography or the scale of the project, the available materials, whatever. I mean, South Sudan would be a completely different story from here in northern Kenya or down in northern Mozambique or whatever.
What is your recommendation to mini-grid companies nowadays? Most of the mini-grid companies are set up as mini-grid operators, so they are prepared to manage existing assets. Unless they also do C&I solar and these kind of things, they do not have the capacity to manage logistics, to do the construction, the installation, the commissioning, and so on. Do you recommend mini-grid companies to build that expertise? Or do you think they should actually hire an EPC company or hire a team on an ad hoc basis? Because most of the companies, they don't build thousands of mini grids. They build some tens and then they just operate for a period of time. And if they have an ongoing engagement with a construction team and they have to pay salaries on an ongoing basis, then it doesn't pay off for them, I guess. What is your recommendation here?
I would advise companies to hire a team, not an EPC contractor. I mean, there are, probably we are not many, but there are person like me, like Chris, that has this experience and that can help companies to exactly unpack and avoid EPC contractor, a standard one that gives you the mini-grid turnkey. Because that will really cost too much. As before, it's a midway, no? The APC to me is the most expensive and, depends the funds that you are using, but most probably will never pay off. Do it yourself as well. It's probably not the option if you are not looking at the CRI. But if you are not looking at that, then you should hire for a period, the rollout phase, people that is used to do that and will help you to manage all the procurement, the logistic, and the installation phase. And the hands up, when they deliver to you the project, you pass into the O&M with the real stuff that you were considering for your business.
I don't see much advantage to hiring an EPC. Most of them are traditionally working for the local utilities, which can be very corrupt systems. Quality is quite low and prices are very high. And fundamentally, you have less control over your project if you put that layer of some business between you and the materials and the workers and the final product. And furthermore, for some of these smaller projects, like we've emphasized repeatedly, it's not a big project for them. It's not the same as grid extension in an entire county or something. And so they throw one or two workers at it. They're so-called project managers who don't have much experience. And then you end up in a position where you're saying, what are these guys here for? Because I'm doing all the management. Conversely, if a developer hires a team for this kind of thing, they don't necessarily need to keep them employed after completion. They're going to do the same thing that the EPC would have done, which is, start with some core project manager and a couple of highly trained electricians or linesmen, and then hire some other electricians and linesmen under that group. And at the end of it all, everybody goes home. This is all contract labor. You do need that core project manager. I'm, of course, proud to say that I am one. Davide mentioned it as well. And there's a bunch of us around Africa and, more every day as more people get experience with this. So really, I think that's the future of mini grids. And of course, many of these companies do aspire to some kind of world domination, like, oh, we're going to have 10,000 mini grid sites within 10 years or, whatever snappy little visionary comment they make like that. Many of these companies do want to manage many, many projects. And can you do that with EPCs in the manner required, with the newer meters, the smart meters, the more stringent quality control, HSE, and general standards required by European and American investors? I don't see that you can. The whole industry needs an upgrade, and I see that best accomplished internally by starting with a core team and building from there. And then eventually you have some kind of very large company. And if you are, in fact, managing 10,000 grids across the continent, then you are going to need a pretty substantive operations and maintenance group.
Now, looking at logistics specifically, there are specialized companies like Bolloré and others that set themselves up specifically for logistics in Africa and also rural Africa. Would you hire such a company to avoid risks of transport and logistics? Or would you say, well, they do it the same way we do it, and, well, after all, delays will anyway hit us if they are coming from their side or if we handle it ourselves? What is your recommendation here?
Yeah, I have not even thought of that for two reasons. The materials I'm buying from the vendors come on trucks that the vendors own or have a normal relationship with. And, perhaps in some case that might be a big logistics company, but here in Africa, more often it's a guy that owns trucks. Conversely, up here in Turkana County, I'm using the local trucks, the guys that speak the Turkana language, the guys that know the best place to cross the dry riverbed, the guys that know how to not get stuck and how to get unstuck when they do get stuck. That's not the Nairobi crowd. And so large logistics company, I got the feeling they wouldn't even return my phone call, be honest.
Because you're too small or because it's too complicated?
Yeah, they know that whatever price they would give me, I would just hang up the phone anyway. And that's something I alluded to in a recent post as well, that I might think that my $50,000 purchase of poles or pole dressing or cables is a lot of money. But for these big companies, $5 million is a lot of money. And so that trickles throughout the whole system, from the procurement to the logistics to everything. Even though it's a lot to me and my small team of linesmen and site overseers, to anybody else, they're like, $50,000 job, not interested. Where's the profit in that? And so, you end up with what we call the mom and pop shops, the small companies that do find some level of profit in that, but they're generally disorganized, informal, less dependable, very hard to determine rates. The rates can change. Guy shows up with a truck and then wants an extra 20% after it's been loaded. Now what do you do? So, we're in a very precarious price point in that regard, in my experience.
Yeah. Price point is a good subject. What do you need to calculate per kilometer of delivery of, 5 tons or 20 tons, typically for a delivery from the harbor to the site? Davide, do you want to pick this up?
Well, it's a very difficult question. It's not only depending on kilometers, but even where the truck has to go. Normally, if the area is very rural, When you do the long, bigger trips, talking about Tanzania from Dar es Salaam up to the highlands, couple of thousands of kilometers, the companies doesn't charge you only the transport cost, but even the risk component. And risk comes from different sources. Like, for example, if part of the trip is on the rough road, the risk of damaging the truck is something that come in, and they are charging for it. As well, if you are passing areas where the relation with the police it's a bit more complicated, they are charging that cost. So you cannot really say to have a flat rate. Planning the budget, a large amount of the budget should be considered for logistic. Not only for the transport, but even for whatever the logistic entails. Normally, my experience, you are always around to 20% of the budget spent in logistic costs. Coming back to the previous question, it is true that sometimes materials should be transported with kind of informal transporter, so people that is owning his own truck. But things changes when you have import or quite valuable items like batteries, panels. I mean, the things that are more valuable and even a bit more fragile. But most of everything when they have passed through the custom. Bollorés and other big companies are always more able than you to discuss with custom authorities, because they are custom agents and they know how to move around things. Otherwise, you risk to stay stuck on the custom boundaries, even without understanding why. No, and weeks pass and you have to pay all the fees related to that. Penalties, fees, that for me is a nightmare. Whenever I have to pass through the custom and I don't have a reliable agent, that for me is really a nightmare.
Have you ever tried importing without an agent?
Honestly, only once. Because I was pushed to do that. I mean, with an agent, with a kind of informal one, no? I mean, you always need an agent because you need someone that is allowed to enter in the custom and to do so. But my experience was terrible, as I said. And to save some couple of $1,000s, then I ended up to spend something like 10,000 more than using Bolloré. Because, of course, Bolloré and these big companies, I mean, they are not the only one. We are talking about them because they are everywhere in Africa and Asia, so everyone knows them. But there are many of these companies, very specialized, and which cost you more, let's say. But it's indeed an investment. In that case, worthwhile. Please, to the audience, don't do it by yourself. You will end up to become crazy and spend a lot of money. Even if you have, the case I was mentioning before was a kind of easy one, because everything was exempted, kind of donation from diocese to another diocese. So, things that doesn't have to pay tax. So basically you think, I just have to the harbor, take it, pick it up and take it out from the custom. No, doesn't work like that. Up to the gate, someone can stop you and you will not know how to move again.
Yeah. Okay, so if we want to import something, then these large logistics companies are definitely useful. But would you then also let them deliver the more expensive inverters or PV panels or so to site? Or would you pick up the goods from the harbor and do the remainder of the logistics yourself?
If the infrastructure allows, I personally prefer them to ship.
For insurance purposes, to make sure that they are safe.
Exactly. Coming back to the Jumeme experience, we had to transport on the island. And of course, that is something that Bolloré will not even quote. I mean, they will not do it.
Yeah.
To Mwanza, where we had the quarter, then yes, because you have 1,500 kilometers in where you are relatively safe.
Chris, we just had a discussion about how much does a kilometer of deliveries cost in rural Africa. Do you want to elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. So here in Kenya, my most experience and most recent experience, I'm finding that transport is about €1.50 to €2 per kilometer, and that would be round trip because the truck cannot load something and return it to its destination. So they charge you both ways. So that could be the same for a lorry coming with 40 drums of cable from Nairobi, a lorry coming with 115 poles from Eldoret. It could be the same for a local truck carrying 10 drums of cable from Lodwar to a site 200 kilometers away. The price seems to be about the same, regardless of the size of the truck and the capacity and the destination. And of course, there's variance within that. And maybe when this is all over, I'll go back and look at it more thoroughly and see if I can find a trend. But that's our general cost range.
And well, this means, after all, that trucks need to be properly loaded. If you have a half-loaded truck, then you pay extra.
Yeah, then you have to hire 2 trucks. You have to do it again.
Davide, then maybe you want to talk about the risk of theft and what you do to prevent theft during transport, during storage on site, even afterwards, after installation.
Yeah, you're right. That is definitely a problematic aspect. And I don't have a straightforward answer. The only one that comes in my mind is something that we already touched previously, which is you need to have people engaged. I mean, they really need to have a sense of ownership on things. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to protect because, everyone is trying to use anti-theft materials, like, bolts, whatever. But that is something that the day after you are leaving can be cutted, can be simply people can even not care about that. Instead, it's people that is protecting the materials. If they understand the potentiality of the mini grid, and normally they do, when you go in the operation phase, then they will protect themselves. Of course, the most problematic part is before that day, when you have all the material there and all the equipment basically easy to be taken. In that case, the collaboration with the local authorities becomes the main way to protect.
Yeah, and actually paying a guard to take care of the equipment is just part of the solution, right?
Indeed.
The guard would potentially keep kids from throwing stones on the PV panels or playing around the equipment. But like if somebody comes with a gun, then what should the guard do, right? He runs.
Exactly. I mean, take panels or cables. The value is enormous compared to the local economies. So there's no proportionality. How can they protect that?
Yeah, but what equipment is most vulnerable in this regard? Like, there is not a market for lithium-ion batteries, right? There's not a market for large PV inverters or so. There's probably not even a market for large PV panels in rural areas. You need to bring this stuff back to the cities to sell it.
True, but panels and cables are something that can have a value, for sure, everywhere, and even panels, because every village, I've been in very, very rural areas of Africa, and everywhere you find a very small shop in a muddy construction with panels. So it means that people is understanding. Then you might use these 500 or above watt peak panels, which has 40 volt output, and they will not be able to use for anything, basically, because the voltage is too high. But they don't know.
They connected anyway.
Exactly. We'll go back to the previous statement. Bigger is better.
I mentioned before, I like the just-in-time delivery, which narrows the window for opportunistic theft. If the stuff's coming from a manufacturer in Nairobi directly to my site and it weighs 500 kilos and it gets locked inside a gate an hour after delivery, that part is taken care of. It's not sitting in a warehouse that could be broken into in the middle of the night with some guys with a 10-ton truck who walk away with 20 drums. I took a risk this year. And we actually put the pole dressing on the poles before erection. That's unheard of in Kenya because in the more densely populated areas, there's plenty of people with linesman experience who have climbing gear that'll scooch right up there and grab that stuff and they can sell it in the local market. Here, we don't have that level of expertise or equipment, and the local market isn't going to buy it because there just isn't enough electrification up here. It's too sparsely populated. I think you guys mentioned theft of cabling or conductors from the overhead lines. That's a huge problem in many places. And for that reason, a lot of people like to do a finish-to-finish schedule sequence so that the conductors and the power plant are completed at the same time and that stuff is energized immediately. That is perceived to be a disincentive to stealing conductors, but it still happens. We, again, have a pretty deep relationship with the community. We rent people's empty houses for storage. So all of our expensive stuff goes into somebody's house. That would be the copper-coated ground rods, the meters, the ready boards. Some of the other things are higher value. They might not be of any value to the local people, but because it's a bright, shiny object, they're more inclined to grab it. And we'll see. I mean, so far we haven't had a problem here, because I think the distribution of the villages, the small size of the villages, anywhere, if somebody's from not around there, it's like they've got a big red arrow over their head. And I've seen that on our villages on the highway. I'll say, who's that guy? And we don't know. He's not from here. They're very wary of theft themselves. So it hasn't been a problem here in Turkana, but in other counties, Busia or Kisii, theft is a huge deal. And of course, your EPC can be in on it. And that's another reason I think that was not really mentioned earlier. An EPC is typically more expensive, but you also have less control at every level, and you are more subject to some kind of overcharging, overbilling. They might say they bought 150 poles, but there's only 110, and you don't find that out until you finally count them a year later, right? So, and that has happened. That's been a big problem here in Kenya with various mini-grid companies that I'm personally familiar with.
Davide, let me start asking you the two final questions. I would like to get some insight from you on what is the biggest hassle of working in rural Africa and what is the greatest joy of working in rural Africa for you?
Well, for me, the hassle comes mainly from bureaucracy. Sometimes you really have to fight against local government, national government, custom authorities. That is where you have the bigger problem. You can just try to adapt yourself, and it's very difficult to find way out, basically. And it has a huge impact on the timeline of a project and the consequent cost, and so make everyone unhappy. But really, when you are on very rural areas, when I was living there, most of this, almost 20 years I've been in Africa, I was living in rural areas, not in capitals. And when you live there, when you are able to create something, well, this is wonderful. I would never change my job for another one. Yeah.
Chris, what is the biggest hassle of working in rural Africa for you, and what is the greatest joy?
Yeah, so I agree with David. The level of bureaucracy and the number of hands out for some kind of demand or other is ginormous, and I'll never get used to that. Quite simply, though, my biggest problem is the flies. I have a constant battle with flies.
Oh.
That's something else I'll never get used to. Biggest joy for me is, quite frankly, just getting shit done in a difficult place where most folks don't even get out of the air-conditioned Land Cruiser. I really savor my ability to assemble a team, train them, make things happen, have beer and chicken at the end of the day, and, just like David said, seeing something accomplished. But this is some of the hardest work I've ever done. And, that's what it's all about for me.
All right. Thank you both. That was very interesting and very insightful.
Thanks to you, Nico.
Well, cool. I enjoyed this. Thanks for the opportunity, and I look forward to hearing it.
That was a pleasure. And thanks to you, Chris, as well.
Hello, my name is Holger Peters, CTO and co-founder of Finances. I always try to be once in the field myself for most of our projects. as this is the only way to understand the local requirements in detail. I'm involved in the process of procurement, logistics and implementation of mini-grid infrastructures for more than 15 years now. As we've heard from Chris and Davide, both practically made very similar experience. The more rural you go, the less predictable transport conditions and business practices become. Details of the work and logistics requirements change from region to region and are available from an informal sector only. There's a very strong benefit involving the locally available workforce for the construction. This local involvement only brings a limited income to the community, but creates a valuable feeling of ownership regarding the installed assets, which is highly important for the later success of operations. The other option could be to bring everything from the capital or abroad with access to better trained workers, more machinery and of better quality. But this usually comes at much too high cost the project cannot manage, as the risk for lacking local experience is part of the budgeting. Both of whom that shared their experience fully agree that the various risks involved in every stage of the project come at their specific cost. Truck drivers and logistics companies charge for the risk of using bad or unsafe roads. The highest risk that needs to be paid for is when involving EPC contractors, who should take the full and overall responsibility for engineering, procurement and construction to deliver a turnkey project within the agreed timeline. This may cost up to 50% additional compared to logistics and construction cost when implementing the project at own risk and assuming to manage the unexpected problems cost efficiently. Every project manager can only rely on own experience when taking the decision of involving external contractors with a lower or higher scope of responsibility for the contribution to the project.
This episode of the Mini Grid Business has been brought to you by Enensys, your one-stop shop for sustainable mini grids. For more information on how to make mini grids work, visit our website, enensys.com, or contact us through the links in the show notes. The Mini Grid Business, powered by Enensys.